Welcome to the Practicing Drummer podcast. My name is Craig, and in this episode, I'm bringing you a conversation I had with Jeremy Dutton in June of 2024. Jeremy was featured in Modern Drummer magazine last year, and his first album as a leader, Anyone Is Better Than Here, has been out for almost exactly a year. You'll hear me raving about how much I like it. Aside from his solo work, he stays really busy playing with Joel Ross, Vijay Iyer, and James Francies. I had a lot of fun getting to know him, learning about his influences, and how he stays at the top of his game. Let's get into it with Jeremy Dutton. All right, man. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Of course, brother. Thanks for having me, man. It's great to get to talk, man.
Yeah, I was very excited to meet you a few months ago when you were in Minneapolis at the Dakota.
Yeah.
Playing with Vijay. Man, it was so cool. It was so great to see you play. It was the first time I've ever seen you play live, and I was just blown away. I mean, I'm aware of your playing, but to watch you play and to see it live, your control of the dynamics and everything was just awesome.
Thank you. That means a lot, man.
Yeah, of course. And then you were just so cool to talk to afterwards, telling me about your cymbals and everything and nerding out a little bit over Instagram after that. So, but before I forget, there's one thing I wanted to ask you about. In doing my research, I found this video on YouTube of you, I think it was in Switzerland at Stefan's basement.
Oh, yeah.
That was so wild. It was, the video starts, and everybody should go look for that, and I'll put a link in the show notes. But, the video starts with this long walk down some stairs and eventually leads to a room with what looks like a Neil Peart, Terry Bozzio kind of kid. And
right.
I'm curious, without giving away too many spoilers, because I don't know what the setup is with that, but how does that come up? And how did you have any time to prepare for that or know what you were getting into? Or was it kind of like a total surprise and sit down and play?
Well, it was definitely a total surprise. You sit down and play, but you're aware. So Stefan owns a great venue in Muri, Switzerland that I think the first time I went there was maybe when I was 19 or 20. Something like that. It was on one of the first tours that I did, and he's had that set up in his house is not far from the venue, so he's had all of these things set up in his basement for years.
Okay.
And so when you go to play at the club, he has you over to his house, and you have dinner. It's a very really communal experience, and also he has so much gear, not just the stuff in his basement, but he's just got like everything. He's got vintage Rogers stuff. He's got Craviotto stuff. He's got anything you can think of. He's got it. So I've been aware of that area for a while. But that was my first time. He started doing the series live from Stefan's basement, or live from the basement, maybe about a year or two ago. And I played there late last year, and he asked me if I would do one, or maybe I asked him. Actually, I don't remember, but I was like, man, I would love to do it. And then, but I didn't have any sort of plan going in necessarily. It was just more, and we filmed it actually in the morning. Before I had to go to the airport. So it was I was very it's interesting playing in the morning because you never, right. I don't usually do that, but, performing in the morning, I should say. I don't usually do that. Usually it's more like practicing and stuff like that.
Sure.
But yeah, it's a great place. And what I like about it, the instruments are obviously very nice. It's very ornate. There's a lot of different percussion stuff, a lot of different, textures, things like that. But I like the setup a lot because it isn't hard to use or anything like that, but it is something that you have to sort of receive on its terms. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There's no like, let me adjust the cymbals and let me
right.
put this tom here. You just sort of have to live with it as it is, which is cool. It's interesting to see what happens when you're in that position.
Yeah. And how did you deal with having so many more choices of instruments to play, versus your usual 4-piece kit with a couple of cymbals and hi-hats?
For me, I just wasn't even, I tried not to worry about that kind of thing or even think about more versus less, because at the end of the day, I feel like if in touch with what you're doing, it kind of translates regardless. It
Mm.
doesn't matter. And I feel like that's something that I've learned through the years of playing, is that even if you maybe don't feel like it does, what you're doing will come across regardless of the situation or the setup. So
Mm.
it was interesting and challenging at times, but it was cool. It was a good challenge, and it was refreshing in a way for me, because it was allowed me to think about some things and approach things in a way that maybe I hadn't done before.
Yeah, it's so cool. I'm so glad that video exists, because it's such a cool thing, and I urge everybody to go check it out. So I want to, one thing I'm just really in love with right now is your album.
Oh, thank you, man.
My word, it is incredible. It's very cinematic.
Thank you.
I've listened to it a lot over the last couple of weeks, and this never happens to me, because I usually have music on just kind of in the background in my headphones as I'm doing stuff. And once in a while, I'll sit down and do some focused listening. But with your album, it just made me want to set up a vibe in my office, get my lights set. I have a light strip in here, and get the blue light on to kind of match the album cover, and just sit back in a chair and really take it in. Anyway, I just want to tell you how much I love it.
Thank you so much, man. That means a lot.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the process. I know you talked about it a bit in Modern Drummer, and I'm going to try to not duplicate a lot of that. But can you talk a little bit about the album title and kind of the motivation and inspiration there, and the concept?
So, well, one, man, just thank you for checking it out. I'm really, it means a lot, just to have released something and to get feedback like that, man, that people are really enjoying it, and it means something to them. I can't overstate how much that means to me, because when you're kind of working on things, it means a lot to you, and
Right.
but at the end of the process, that's kind of the funniest part about it, is that you're sort of like, man, I wonder how I wonder how other people are going to receive this.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, but anyway, it means a lot. Anyone is better than here. The album title is actually part of there's a kind of like a poem that I wrote many years ago, not many years ago, maybe like 2 years ago. And, that's one of the lines in the poem, but I feel like, as an expression, basically what it's talking about is, there's so much searching that goes on in life, and so much, in every business, not just music. There's so much ambition, and so much, you're striving to reach the next level and get to the next place in life. But what I feel like, a good summary of what I've learned, in my time here in New York, and just in life in general, is that it doesn't, no matter where you go, no matter what you achieve, you still have to kind of deal with yourself and who you are.
Yeah, right.
And so I think a lot of times and I'm speaking for myself as well, we look at the situation and say that we wish the situation was more ideal.
Mm.
It's like, if I have, even if we just go to the drums, like, well, once I get, these drums, once I get these cymbals,
Right.
then it's going to be this thing. And then you get those drums and those cymbals, and then you're like, okay, now that I have this, once I get these, then it's going to be really, and you sort of, the restlessness, I think, comes a lot from just not being able to, not accepting, like, man, who we are within those things. And so I guess, I don't guess that's what it is that, anyone is better than here is just sort of a call to find a way to accept yourself in the things that you do. You know what I mean? And understand that no matter where you go in life, no matter what you achieve musically, whatever, spiritually, it doesn't matter. You're still you. And so, it's almost like, the way I explain it sometimes is that the person waiting for you is you in the end. In the end, like, you're going to be running into yourself. So it's kind of like, you can have all these things, you can achieve all these things, you can get to all these places, but at the end, if you haven't really dealt with who you are or accepted who you are, then you're kind of always going to have that feeling of just, which is some of which is natural. I get it. You know, we're all a little bit restless in some ways, and I think that's good to some extent. But I'm just meaning there's a very specific culture that I'm talking about nowadays with people where it feels like people are encouraged to constantly be striving to change who they are and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, make themselves better in whatever way that, but not ever asking like, well, what does it mean to be better? You know what I mean? What does it mean for you, when you're saying better? Who's better are you really searching for? So kind of like that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of self acceptance, basically.
Yeah, and that's really such an awesome thing that you realize all of this at such a young age, because you're still in your 20s, right?
I just turned 30 last December.
Oh, you did? Oh, cool,
I
cool.
did turn 30 finally.
Nice. Did that feel any different for you, or just another number?
Definitely like turning a corner in a way, but it felt in the end it felt good. You know what I mean? It feels like a blessing to get older. I try not to be one of those people that's sad about getting older. Or I mean, I definitely had some anxiety when it was coming up, which was,
Oh, you did?
which I was told was natural by my mom and my family. Was like, yeah, that happens to everybody. But
yeah,
generally speaking, I feel like I've always known, even when I was very young, I knew a lot of cool people who were a lot older than me. So I try not to look at getting older as something that's not desirable. You know what I mean? It's great.
So I guess sort of on this topic of, you know, getting older and thinking about time, one of the questions I have here, and then I want to get back to some more technical things about the album. I know you started writing the album or finished writing the album during the pandemic when you had some time.
Mm-hmm.
But how did you think about releasing the album and deciding that it was time to put one out? Was that something where you were thinking about career, or was it more of a personal thing for you? You know, because I think, we all know there is rarely a monetary incentive to releasing an album, right?
Of course.
How did you know it was the right time for you, especially since you're so young?
I think it came from a more personal space. I wanted to put something out because I felt like I had something to say, like there was something there, even though in the beginning it was kind of an abstract feeling, you know what I mean? So I feel very strongly that making an album is it's like that at first. I think it can be a very distinct thing from the beginning, like this is what's happening and this is what it's going to be. But I often think that, at least for me, a lot of the process is you're approaching a feeling and you don't really necessarily know right away what the feeling is. You're more, it's kind of all being revealed as you go along, and you're sort of discovering like, oh, okay, when I'm moving closer to these things, when I'm writing things like this is like the feeling of what I'm trying to capture. These are the things that are resonating with me. So, it was definitely a personal thing. It was definitely something that I had been wanting to do for a long time, but it felt like it was time. And the pandemic, I think, kind of helped with that a little bit, because it was such it's understated to say it was a curveball, but it was,
yes,
it was such a turning point for everything in the world, but definitely for my life at that time, because you just kind of went from traveling all the time to just zero travel and kind of being in this period of relative isolation for a long period of time. So it was more of a personal decision. I don't think of it. I think career wise, I'm not somebody who, not that I don't understand the way that, business works, and, there are things that you decide for your career, but I try to approach, I wanted for me to get the best out of myself, I have to approach it from a place that feels personal, I think, and doing something because I feel like I have something to say, not because, it's time to put out your album, that kind of vibe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And the album does feel like a very complete statement. I mean, again,
Thank you.
I can't overstate how incredible it is to listen to from
Thank you.
top to bottom. And then we've also had it on casually in the house over dinner, and my fiance, immediately when it came on, ooh, what's this? Ooh, cool, I like this. And so that's great too. Getting back to the album being such a personal thing for you, I'm curious to know that when you got to the point of recording and deciding that it was time to record, did you already have a complete vision and set of tunes and sequence in mind? Or how did you make that transition from I'm writing to I know that I'm ready to record this?
The ending I felt was very clear, but in the beginning, and especially in the writing and recording stages, it was kind of not vague, but very like I'm just following a feeling. I don't know necessarily what the feeling is. I can't be like I wasn't in a position to be, oh, this is what it is. And I think that, thinking about it now, that's the type of musician I am as well, which is that it's sort of like it's a way of surrendering kind of to who you are. I mean, in sync with the title, I guess that's just kind of how I am, which is that I've learned, you have to trust yourself, and sometimes you have to follow feelings, even if you can't exactly identify why. You know what I mean? And there's so much of the need to, again, it's natural, but the need to identify, the need to, plan everything out and be in control of everything
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a part of it. I did plan a lot of this, but in the end, I think, did I know when I was going to record this that it was going to be what it is? No, absolutely not. I didn't know, but I think I like that because I like the process as something that's not, it's almost like it's a conversation between me and whatever I'm making. It's me and this music. It's not like it's not me controlling everything. It's not me having absolute power over everything or whatever. It's me sort of talking with this music that I have and figuring out what the message is in that, and then understanding like, oh, okay, this is kind of that feeling that I've had, the strong feeling, and what's been pulling me forward. This is what has been pulling me forward for. Like, this is what it is. This is what that feeling is. And there was things that was left on the table, tunes that we recorded that I didn't end up using. And I think towards the end, maybe I'll say, because it wasn't recorded all at the same time. That's the other thing, is that there were a few different sessions, basically over maybe a year's time. It wasn't all recorded at once. By the end, it was definitely starting to become like shape wise. It was starting to take shape in my mind. And then during from sitting with the music, I started to, that's when it feels like, okay, now I really am seeing this for what it is, because it's such making a record is such or at least for me, it's a very personal process, but also it involves you activating so many different parts of yourself. You know what I mean? So like, you're a participant in the record, obviously. So you're playing music, you're writing the music, you're also organizing the sessions, you're also, managing personalities, you're also, making kind of producer like decisions in a way. And then after that, after it's all recorded, then you're kind of into a different phase, a different way of thinking. You know what I mean? You're not, but you're still, it all is a part of the art itself, I think, but it's just, you're activating different parts of your mind and your ability. And for me, that's what it was. I followed the feeling that I had.
And you worked with Kendrick Scott as producer on this album.
Yes.
Can you give me some idea about what his input was throughout the process and what that relationship was like? I know he was a teacher of yours and a friend. And what was the dynamic like when he was helping produce the album?
Kendrick was very, I've known Kendrick for a long time. And I wanted, when I started to do this, I wanted him to come in to produce, not just because I love his records, but because he's somebody that I felt that I obviously have a lot of respect for, but I've known him for so long, and he's known me when I first moved to New York, and then, up to this day. I actually saw him yesterday, but
Mm.
he's known me for so long, and it's not. It's kind of like I wanted somebody who had that sort of perspective on me to be there as a producer who was not involved in the playing necessarily. So you're just sort of listening. And I've obviously learned so much from Kendrick through the years, and I continue to. He's somebody that I feel like when you talk about vision, he's somebody that I would point to, not just on the drums, but just with any artist. He's somebody that I think has intense vision in all the projects that he does, and really puts out things that I feel like are complete in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was curious, and I wanted to have that perspective. But in the studio itself, I feel, again, he really did a great job, because he was actually very careful, and not, he wasn't, it needs to be like this, it needs to be like that. He was very much guiding, but not steering in a way that, meaning like, oh, it needs to be this. And in fact, I think he was sort of, he let everything flow very naturally. And one of the things that he said to me in the session, I remember, is that you can't make it be something more than what it is, which sounds kind of cryptic and vague. But what he was saying is that you sort of have to allow this music, kind of goes back to that conversation. It's like the music, you have to let it do its thing.
Mm.
You can't force it into a direction, like force it to be what you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really going to work. You have to let it, let the tunes breathe, let the music breathe, and let it speak for itself in a way. So it was great.
Did he have a lot of input after the recording and the editing process and post-production as well, with regard to sequencing, or?
Not really.
Okay.
No, that was mostly me and my a close friend of mine who is an engineer, but he is also listed as I think co-producer is Jason Roskowski. He owns a studio called Cycle Studios here in New York.
Oh, yeah.
But he and it was me. I worked through the sequencing myself, and I kind of played with a bunch of different orders for a while. I mean, obviously I knew that there was going to be the opening and the closing. I had that. But within that, I kind of wanted to see what makes the most sense. But again, Kendrick, I think for him, if I had asked him his input on that, I'm sure he would have given it. But I think, like, even as a teacher, it's funny. We're both from Houston.
Yeah.
And just knowing him for so long, I feel like I already know what his approach would be, which would be to be like, man, again, you have to follow. Like, I'm not going to tell you how to do this. You need to follow what you're feeling. Like, follow how you're feeling. Think of it. He may give me some things to think about, but it's very much, I think he's always been somebody that is an advocate for taking responsibility, and not control necessarily, but
ownership,
taking responsibility. Yeah. Taking ownership. There you go.
Mm-hmm.
of your art. You know what I mean? And I have a lot of respect for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the sequencing and the post-production, that was all me and my friend Jason. And we sort of worked through that together.
Yeah.
And I had input from some friends as well. Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah. Well, the end result is wonderful. And just to wrap up this part of the conversation, I have a fairly trivial question to ask you. I'm curious what software you use for writing.
Sibelius,
Okay.
mostly, and then I also have Logic Pro that I use to make demos sometimes,
Okay.
which are usually bad, but
but it helps give you an idea of sort of the sonic qualities you want, and
of course,
yeah.
it gives me different, because you can't. I don't want to. If I have an idea that I'm like, I wonder, will this work? It's like, I don't want to call a bunch of people over to be like, okay, now you play this and you play
Right.
I just want to see, like, is this going to work? And usually, it's like, if I can get it to kind of work in Logic, that means that it will probably definitely work in person.
Yeah. Cool. Cool.
That kind of vibe.
You mentioned growing up in Houston.
Mhm.
And so now I want to kind of go back to your early years. I read that I think that I read that you're the only musician in your family. You didn't come from a family of musicians. So I'm curious how you got into playing and how the drums went over in the house with non-musicians. And can you talk a little bit about that and how old you were?
Yeah, so I was very young when I started to play drums. I have three older brothers and one little sister, big family. But my mom basically always explains that there was like a toy drum set or whatever that, had been around in the house for a while. But she said that of your brothers, like you were the only one that really, you seemed to really like playing these drums. So, and you really leaned into that. And I got lucky, man. My family, even though there are no musicians, they were always very encouraging. I can't think of a time when they were like, you should, maybe you shouldn't play drums, that kind of vibe. There was never any of that. It was always pushing me forward in a way and trying to, because I think when I was about 6 or 7, I got my uncle and my mom took me to buy my first like real drum set.
Oh, nice. Do you remember what that was?
It was it was like a CB drums.
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
know. I think one of those sets, like a small one. And so that was like my first drum set that I had at the house. And that was, exciting for me.
Oh, yeah.
And, I don't remember any of this. This is all secondhand, but my mom was like, yeah, you used to put on like concerts for us. It was really, so it was, I'm like, I can't imagine how bad that sounded. That must have sounded so bad. You guys are really great people. but yeah, it's kind of bizarre thinking. The older I've gotten, the more I've been like, man, what a bizarre and very special thing that my family, because they're smart people and they love music, obviously, but at a certain point, what has to happen, they don't know. Like they can't be like, well, maybe you should play more rudiment. Like, you really need to practice in 5 more, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't happen. It's all just sort of practice and
So did you start in on lessons pretty early then, or?
No, man, I didn't start taking lessons until maybe I was in middle school. Actually, it was always just something that I was just doing kind of with my own guidance. And I used to watch the drummer we used to go to this church not far from my house. And I do remember I used to sit on the steps at the church and just watch the drummer there play a lot.
Oh,
and
cool.
I would like go home and try to, imitate that kind of thing. And, just from whatever music I was listening to at that time, I would try to emulate whatever was happening.
And were you playing along to the records or?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it playing along. Probably more like playing over them. But
okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Let's go with that. But around the time I was in 5th grade, I went to a summer camp called the Summer Jazz Workshop. And that's where I met Craig Green, who is a great jazz drummer and a great teacher who a lot of the people from Houston, he's like a Houston legend. But he was really the first person. I went to that camp, and then my parents my mom was wondering like what I was going to do for middle school. And he sort of told my mom, that he taught at this middle school that has a jazz program. At the time, it was called Johnston Middle School. And he was like, you should send him here. Like he should come here, and then he'll be able to like play at school and be in the jazz band. And it was there that I felt like I got my first taste of sort of discipline in terms of, like practice structure, thinking about different things like that. And just sort of, I would say not even structure, but just exposure to things that I had never really heard before or thought of necessarily. And
is that when you first started getting into jazz music?
I love, funnily enough, I had my uncle really loves Frank Sinatra. So growing up, we used to, he loves to tell this story about me and all my brothers in the car. And he's like, I'd put on that Frank Sinatra and your brothers would be like, oh, but he was like, you were the only one. I was like, yeah.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Excited about it. So I used to listen. Actually, early on, that was a lot of what the jazz I first heard was just my uncle playing it for me. And it was like just Frank Sinatra stuff. I remember maybe it was about the same time in 5th grade, my uncle has a friend that loved jazz named John Beal, and he burned me, I think it was like 6 CDs. And one of them was Kind of Blue, Brian Blade Fellowship. I think it was Perceptual, that one. And then Wayne Shorter, it was Speak No Evil, Art Blakey, the Big Beat,
Oh
that
yeah.
one, and I forget what the other two were, but basically of those records, I remember the the one that I really loved the most at that time, and that really made me curious. And I remember listening to and being like, "Man, what the hell is the Art Blakey record,
Oh yeah.
the Big B?" And I remember listening, being like, "Man, what?" That was like a real turning point for me. And funnily enough, somehow those CDs they kind of floated around the house, so I would find them like every few years and be like, "Oh, I remember these,"
Mm.
and put them on. And I remember, but the first one I really loved was the Art Blakey one, and that made me curious, and so I just wanted to do everything like Art Blakey and be like Art Blakey, and that was sort of my introduction, man, to jazz itself, was, or in a way, that was sort of the introduction. Yeah, it kind of just grew from there. I just followed that with my family and my uncle and my mom and just everybody, my brothers being so encouraging. I just sort of followed that interest.
And going from, Sinatra and Art Blakey to the kind of music and the kind of player you are today, there's a
Mhm.
pretty wide gap between the two. And I know you mentioned in your Modern Drummer interview that sort of what bridged the gap for you a bit were players like Chris Dave,
Mhm.
Brian Blade, Eric Harland.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you can share a couple albums from each player that folks should check out.
Of course. So going off of that last thing, I told you about the Art Blakey record, and then years later, Brian Blade came to Houston and played with Chick Corea
Mm.
at and it was like Chick Corea. The band was crazy. It was like Brian Blade, Chick Corea, Kenny Garrett, maybe John McLaughlin, and I forget who was on bass actually. Maybe it was Christian McBride. But anyway, that was like, seeing Blade play live was really, a mind blow. I still
Yeah.
remember that first performance, like seeing that happen and being like, holy shit.
Mm-hmm.
And but album wise, I think it was Perceptual was like that was the first thing of his that I heard. And even at the time, like I didn't realize, oh wow, he's writing like a lot of these things and all that. But I just so took that on, and then starting to check out the stuff that Blade was doing with Kenny Garrett. Like Triology is
So
a big
good.
one. So good. Yeah, I still listen to that all the time. What's the other one?
Oh, Pursuance?
Yeah, Pursuance. There it is. That's another great one with Blade for sure, and just everything. I started to look in. Again, I don't want to. I'm trying to be careful and not rewrite history, because there's a lot of Blade records that I learned about
Sure.
later on. But I know that I knew those in high school for sure, and maybe even a little bit in middle school.
Mm-hmm.
For Chris Dave, some of the first Chris Dave stuff I heard was when I first went to high school. There was a guy, and actually I'm going to say his name because I don't think he'll ever hear this, but he played trombone. His name was Keith Brown. I don't know why he had these things, but he had these bootlegs from New York. So he was like, yeah, if you want to borrow the CD and burn it on your computer, like I have these live shows of Glasper
Oh, wow.
and Chris Dave playing. And it was like 2 CDs worth of that. And one of them was live at the Blue Note,
Okay.
which I still have. And it's like, the band is crazy. It's Chris Dave, Roy Hargrove, Glasper, Lionel Oweke.
Hmm.
I'm not sure who's on bass. Oh, maybe it's Vicente actually on the bass. Vicente Archer.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe.
Because Vicente's on that double booked album
Yeah,
of Glasper
maybe.
with Chris Dave.
But it's an insane. That was another moment of like hearing somebody play that way and being like, "What the hell is going on?" Like,
I know.
like whoa, and just sort of following that. Like that was some of my first Chris Dave stuff that I heard. And for me, those really and truly, I started to try to collect bootlegs of Chris, like as many as I could. And when I was in high school, I think his Modern Drummer like cover story came out when I was in high school. So I read a lot of that stuff, and then was checking out some of the other stuff he did with Mint Condition.
Oh, yeah.
And, then obviously Double Booked came out, and he sounds great on that.
Yeah.
But those bootlegs were really my early, like, to this day, those are my favorite those are my favorite recordings of Chris. And
might have to talk to you about that later. I'd love to hear
yeah, of
those.
course. And then on YouTube, I used to go and see Chris play with Kenny Garrett as well. So I started to like see that there was an overlap there with Blade and Chris. With Eric Harlan, I'm trying to remember. The first thing I ever heard of him was him playing with the Aaron Goldberg trio. That album Worlds.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I know that one.
It's very, very good. In my opinion, I mean, it has a special place just because at the time I had never heard anything like that, or I had never heard anybody play that way. But it's such a great trio record, and it's a great example of how powerful a jazz trio can be, when they're all listening and moving together. But to talk about the drums specifically, when I remember hearing Eric play on one of the tracks, and I still remember, where I remember where I was and listening to it on these big speakers in high school and being like, man, it sounds like I see kind of colors when I'm hearing it. Like it sounded like colors to me. That's the only way I could really explain it at the time. But it made me curious about Eric, and so I started. He's got a really expansive recording history, and again, I want to be careful not to rewrite history. But I know I checked out a lot of his Aaron Goldberg stuff, and and that led me to a lot of other people to check out as well. But yeah, those were some of my first interactions.
So do you still hear in color or think of colors when you're playing?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I mean, not consciously. Generally speaking, I'm a visual thinker. You know what I mean? I love movies. I love, I used to watch, I was one of those people that could watch the same movie over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So, but I think visually, and even outside of music in life, and my memory is very visual in a way. So I feel as though the two things are very closely related. And, I don't have like synesthesia or anything like that. But when I say hearing colors, I just mean it's really hard to describe. But it's one of those things that I think if you heard it, I think you would know what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a hard thing to talk about.
Yeah. But when I'm playing in itself, sometimes I think about like color, but mostly I try to just be present in whatever's happening.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And let whatever's happening just sort of be what's going on.
Yeah, and since you just mentioned being present, there's one thing that I noticed watching you play, and I've seen it several times in different YouTube videos. Before songs, you seem to take a moment to sort of center yourself and kind of ground yourself and go within for a moment.
Right.
Is that something that you do consciously? And can you talk about that process and what it does for you a little bit?
Yeah, it is conscious in a way. I mean, it came from, I think it was something that developed naturally. You know what I mean? It wasn't something that I sought out. It's just something that began to happen. And when I do it, I don't always realize that that's what I'm doing. But I feel like it's important to me because of all the travel. And when you play in different contexts all in a row, you need routines to help you be where you are. You know what I mean? Like just be and ground yourself and let you, I mean, you said it, just grounding yourself and trying to be present. I think it's just a ritual for me that I feel like helps me internalize, here we are, we're on stage and there's nothing, that's what this is. We're on stage and there's no fear. There's nothing to be afraid of. You're just here.
Yeah.
You're here and let things, kind of a reminder. I think for me, a reminder to let things flow and not try to be too controlling and try to be, not necessarily pushing things in a certain way, just sort of letting whatever happens come about naturally in a way.
Yeah. And this leads me to want to ask about something else that's somewhat related. You talk about contradictions a lot, and I've heard you talk about it from different angles, the contradictions within yourself as a person, how it's a part of nature, and then with musicians. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how contradictions come into play on the bandstand and how that helps keep the flow and keep you present?
Yeah. So on the bandstand, I mean, I feel like the contradictions are it's a hard thing to point out immediately, but the contradictions are the only way to explain why things don't always go the way that you think they're going to go. You know what I mean? And within a certain song, there are many different stories to tell, many different ways to go. But I think being open, understanding that it could be this way, but also it might not be. It might be the complete opposite. You know what I mean? Like this song that's usually a very aggressive song, actually, in a certain way, if it comes at the right moment, could be something that's more like a ballad. You know what I mean?
Mm.
It could be something that's more, relaxed and breathing. And the same goes for, a song that's normally softer, depending on where it is in the set. It could be a totally, raucous, like a lot of energy, a lot happening.
Hmm.
And it feels like there's so much, as you start to play, at least for me, as I start to play more and more, I understand those kind of subtle cues and understanding that a song isn't just one thing. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
this song is always going to be this way. It's always going to happen like this. Sometimes a song can be more in the pocket. It can be more groove based. It could also be, totally free and open. It could be both at the same time. It could be neither. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
There's so many. Something on the occasions that I teach, I feel like I describe that by telling people that, it doesn't have to be anything. You have to remove that sort of thinking from it. It's like when you start to think this has to be this, then you immediately like close yourself off to
Yeah.
all the things, all the possibilities.
Yeah, getting back to
Um,
not being controlling and being open and
exactly.
present.
Right. I mean, and those contradictions are, they're called contradictions, but even that, contradiction has such and the underlying feeling behind that word is negative, but I don't mean it in a
Right,
negative
right.
way. I mean it more as something that I personally I feel is natural. It's just something. It's just acknowledging that you know there are rules. There are things that you do, things that you don't do, but those rules are sort of fluid. They're not written in stone. And oddly enough, the better you get at understanding the rules, the more you can start to bend them and you start to see that, oh, that rule is true, but it's also not true. Like I can create a scenario where that rule actually is the wrong thing.
Yeah, and you can move away
And that,
from it and come back to it because you know it.
yeah, exactly. You start to see, two things can, again, for me, it's just acknowledging something that it's not something that I'm creating. It's just acknowledging something that already exists
Hmm.
within myself, within people, within life. I feel, and definitely within music, and thinking about it now, that's a lot of what I've learned in New York is that because when you're, I mean, still consider myself a student, but when you're younger, you can get caught on that side of things of like, whoa, I did this because it was the right, I wanted to be right, or I wanted to do the right thing in
Hmm.
that moment. And then it's like, okay, but the problem is that right thing that you wanted to do at that moment was actually the wrong thing. Wrong thing. Like technically, sure, it's like if everybody's lost on the bandstand and if you're playing piano and you're the one person who knows where everything is, you know, you're not necessarily going to, you could be like, well, I'm playing the right chord there. Right. But it's like, yeah, but the problem is it sound like within the context of what's happening, it doesn't sound good.
Hmm.
It actually is the wrong
Hmm.
thing to be doing. The best thing to do is to just, figure out some common ground. You know what I mean? So I feel very strongly that those contradictions are part of us getting closer to music, but also kind of getting closer to ourselves as well.
Yeah, that's great. And before I forget, you mentioned teaching. Do you have a sense of why students seek you out and what they're looking looking to get from you, or any kind of common themes that you end up trying to impart on students?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people first come to study with me, they come because they want like technique advice, basically, and to learn different technique and you know that kind of thing. And I feel like the initial introduction to studying with me is to understand like we will talk about technique, and that's but we need to understand that technique is only a small part of what's happening within the within this music and within drums itself. A lot of it is through that. I would say it's like people coming for technique, and I I feel like my goal as a teacher is to try to, as much as it's about learning certain things, it's also about trying to get people to think in a certain way, think differently, and
Mm.
problem solve
Mm.
and approach things in the right way. Because I feel like for everything I've learned, I understand that your mindset is everything. If you have the right mindset, then you will, there's no problem that you won't be able to solve. But it doesn't matter how good you are, if you're not thinking correctly, you're going to run into a huge problem at some point, and you're not going to be able to get around it.
Can you talk a little bit more about what that right way of thinking is, or sort of the way to get out of your own way?
I wouldn't say necessarily that it's a right way of thinking. I think of it more as everyone has a way that you think naturally. Like you have a way of understanding the world and the things around you that is inherent to whoever you are.
Sure.
I'm trying to get students to recognize that. Like for me, even going back to what I said earlier, like I think visually, I know so much of the way I play and the way that I've learned and gotten better and practiced is understanding that process at a very basic level of this is how I think.
Mm.
And that to me is more important. It's fun. I don't know how many people approach it this way, but for me, I find it to be almost the most important thing is the way that you think, because that's going to take you understanding how you think and understanding how you can approach things mentally will take you closer to what you're playing in a way that it'll make what you're doing feel more personal. And I feel as though there's a lot of focus on, which rightfully so, in there's no, don't get me wrong, the fundamentals are the fundamentals, the basics are the basics. There are things that you have to learn,
Right.
absolutely. But a lot of attention is placed on, I would call like external values and things that, like even technique, I feel is something that without context, it doesn't really mean anything. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
just, so for me, I guess that's sort of what I try to get. I try to understand and to get to know students in a way where I feel like, okay, I think I can a little bit understand how they think and how they approach certain things and the choices they're making. And then I feel like my goal is to draw their attention to those choices so that they can see, like, you see how the way that you're thinking about this, you're thinking about it from this direction. What if you thought about it from coming from a totally different perspective? You know what I mean? I feel like that's what, in my life at least, that's what good teachers have always done, is that they always expand your vision,
Mm.
expand what you're thinking. They're not trying to limit you. They're trying to figure out, okay, this is how, even though it can seem like a teacher is limiting you, because like I said before, there are things that you have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
I understand now that actually some of those things that they're asking you to do are not limits. They're actually trying to expand what you're doing. But the only way to expand in this kind, to get you to think this way is to make you have to do this sort of thing. And then from there, I can take you to a place where or not even me, it's like there you start to naturally progress towards a place.
Mm.
So, obviously, it's difficult. It's difficult, but I enjoy, in the times that I've gotten to really work with students, I really do enjoy that process and seeing that happen. Of like, more than anything, I enjoy seeing people become more aware of themselves and become more aware of what they're doing on the drums. And it takes it from a place of like, well, I'm doing this for a particular reason. And it takes it to, I'm doing this because this is a part of me. This is a part of my life. This is a part of who I am now.
Mm.
And I feel like that's the most valuable thing.
Yeah, and part of it's, not just opening somebody's mind, but is there part of it that's also helping them embrace their natural?
Of course.
Yeah.
Because there's so much, everybody goes through that even not just in music, but in life, everybody goes through that, wanting to be someone else. You know what I mean? Wanting to emulate someone else.
Right. It goes back to what we were talking about at the top here about embracing who you are and where you are.
Exactly.
And acceptance.
Exactly. And there's so much, to a certain extent, again, talking about contradictions, to a certain extent, that's natural. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's even part of understanding who you are, is first trying to be like somebody else. And then, everyone, inevitably you get to the point where you realize, oh shit, I'm not gonna be that person.
Right.
I'm not them. Or you realize, like, that person already exists. Do I want to spend my life? Do I want to spend my energy trying to be this person, or can I, or is there something more for me? And sometimes that's a scary thing, that can be frightening, because if you strip that away of like, okay, well, I don't know, who am I going to be if I'm not imitating someone, then who am I going to be? You know what I mean? I don't know who is that person. I have to like find a way to get to know. I have to go into the unknown, kind of. And that to me is where I try to get people. Is I'm like, yes, into the into the unknown you go.
Yeah.
Obviously, but with the understanding that that's the same. The unknown isn't bad. It's actually, again, kind of bringing it back to what we were talking about. That's where the conversation with yourself, I think, starts. Is where you have to ask yourself, like, well, Art Blakey is Art Blakey. Who is, who are you? Wayne Short is Wayne Short. Who are you? That kind of vibe.
Yeah. And, maybe this is a way to get a little bit more into the detail of this. You mentioned that you would record yourself practicing and listen back, and we all know how painful that can be.
Absolutely.
Do you recall at any point, even now, but more so in your development, hearing yourself back and the parts of your playing that maybe you decided that you liked and you wanted to explore more, and parts that you decided like, no, that needs to go?
Definitely early on, I feel like there was a lot of that. Even now, it's, I guess I'll talk about before I talk about modern times, but yeah, a long time ago, I feel, listening back, I definitely used to try to, I would hear myself doing certain things, certain habits that I had, and understand. And in my mind, the process is, why? One, why is that happening? And two, how can I get away from that? You know what I mean? And usually for me, if I can understand, again, as I got older, it's like, if I can understand why it's happening or why I'm doing it, then it makes it easier to stop. You know what I mean? Because I understand, okay, you're doing that because it's just a habit. You're just always doing that. There's also just feel stuff. You know what I mean? Early on, I remember that was a thing.
Oh, yeah.
Like the ride feel, and that kind of working towards that, and trying different things, and listening back and being like, well, it's not working, or this is working more, or even, I, over multiple days or weeks or whatever, understanding like, wow, this felt really good here. And then, maybe several weeks later, it's like, this doesn't feel as good. Why do these two things it could be the same people, but it's like, why does this feel good and this didn't? Like, what was different about my playing that day? Or what was, what have I been practicing? What have I been working on do I feel like has been changing what I'm doing? So yeah, definitely. I feel like listening back, I also learned as I got into high school, listening back, and college even, I started to understand the value of stepping back, as not listening to things right away. Sometimes.
Yeah, that's huge.
And because there was a lot of shows that I played early on that if I had been a critic, I was like, 1 star, worst concert ever. That was terrible. And then I listen back, months later or something and be like, actually, this was good.
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah.
this was a good show. I feel bad about it. And meanwhile, and then I'm like, God, I was so horrible to everybody after that.
Mm,
I should have been nice to everyone. This was a good show. So I've learned from that. And also just even from my peers, seeing that's a big eye opening thing is seeing other people tear themselves down
mm,
has been a thing that I'm like, okay, I don't want to be a part of that. Like that's not healthy because if you get again, it's good to be critical and good to be self aware. Obviously, with these recordings, we're recording yourself, but once it gets, you don't want it to develop an abusive sort of thing with yourself where you're always, it's never good enough.
right,
You're just
right.
got terrible
Yes.
because then what happens is you start to live with that and you kind of get it doesn't matter what happens, what you achieve or where you go, it'll never you always be living with that voice that's saying, oh, it's terrible. And
Mm-hmm.
I do know some people who have that, and it's really unfortunate because they're
Mm.
brilliant people, brilliant musicians, and it's like, man, to see you beat yourself up like that is just not. I just don't like that.
Yeah.
So recording is I would say like recording myself has definitely been very beneficial. It's something that I do a lot and did a lot of, probably even more when I was younger. Listening back, even now for the past few years, I sometimes make it part of my practice routine. Like on days that are, if I'm having like an off day or something, or if I'm getting like stagnant, then I make the day a performance day. And what it is that basically in my mind, I don't usually write it down, but I'll perform for myself. Basically, is I set a recording, I perform certain songs, and then maybe I give myself like 10-minute break, and then I listen back
Mm.
to everything I just recorded while and that's practice for the day is me kind of reviewing what I was playing and trying to understand like, okay, these are, but I try to also make sure I do it at a time that is, when I can be gentle with myself. Cause
Yes.
I
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
I know for me, I tend to be like, man, really, you know, that sucked. It could really get dark. So I try to make sure it's a day where I feel good and I'm comfortable. And so I can be critical without being like overly critical to the point of, it's not helpful anymore.
Yeah, so when you do record yourself as a performance that way and you're playing a tune, can you give me an example of that? Like what kind of tune are you picking and then
Yeah.
what's your approach? Are you
So it could be a blue, it could be a blues or something like that, or rhythm change or a standard of
Uh-huh.
some sort. So let's say it could be evidence, and then it's like, okay, so the form for this will be you play the melody, and then you play uh, two choruses a time, and then take a solo, and then take the melody out. And then, but within that, I can give myself challenges sometimes. So sometimes I'm like, okay, now we're going to add like a dynamic aspect to it.
Mm.
For your solo, the first 8 bars of the A section needs to crescendo or decrescendo, right? And then the bridge needs to be at this dynamic level. And then the last chorus or the last 8 bars needs to be, needs to be at this dynamic level. And you're sort of repeating that over and over again. You do it. It's really endless. From there. So it can go from something like that, which is obviously very structured, to something else to being like, okay, now you're going to play an intro into Moments Notice, right? You're going to play Moments Notice at the end. Like that will be where you're going. But the goal is, sometimes again, adding a different challenge is like, okay, you have 2 minutes. So there's a two
Mm.
minute timer on. And again, you can add like dynamic challenges there to be like, okay, I want the 2 minutes to be one big crescendo. So, it needs to start, pianissimo. And then at the 1 minute mark, it should be mezzo forte. And then at 2 minutes, it needs to be double F, and then you're playing the melody to Moments Notice
Mm.
at the end of that. But just finding ways to think. Again, I try to take it very seriously and make sure that because I know I'm going to have to listen back to this, so I want it to sound good.
Right, right.
So I try to take it super seriously and to be as given it structure, but more like not structured so much as shape. Make sure kind of like a real performance would be in terms of a set list in a way where there's, if I wouldn't perform these songs back to back, then let's not perform them right now back to back. Like let's make sure. Sometimes there's original tunes that I by myself or other people that I'll play and then come up with some sort of challenge there.
And how strict are you with yourself about plowing forward, even if you're not liking what you did or something? When you say you treat it like a performance, does that mean you never kind of stop and reset, or?
I definitely stop and reset sometimes. If there's something that happens, I'm like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to have to listen back to that. That's going to be real bad. Then I'll stop. But generally speaking, I try to live with the mistake. If I make a mistake or mess something up, because that's a big part of it as well, is not just hitting a mistake and then stopping and starting again because you hit a mistake, but making a mistake and figuring out how to sort things out. Like, how can you make something good happen, even though the mistake is making the mistake a part of what you're doing, as opposed to being like, oh, fuck, I got to start over.
Right. Since we're on the topic of practicing, there's something I want to talk to you about that I may not be able to articulate terribly well, but I think we'll get there. I want to talk more about the sort of fusion influenced playing you do. Like the solo over the vamp on your song Waves. It's so dense and angular. Right. It's chop heavy, but it's not like chops for chop's sake. And then, oh man, is it James Francies? His album Purest Form?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, that's a great record. But, you're playing on that, specifically, well, I mean, the whole album is great, but specifically I'm thinking about, I think you take a solo over My Favorite Things.
Yes.
But it's not like a jazz version of My Favorite Things. And then Levitate is that super linear, chopped up kind of groove. Can you talk about where that type of playing came from for you? Like, did it come from your experience playing in Houston, or what kind of things did you like practice to get that style of playing so dialed in? Because so many jazz drummers never even approach this.
Yeah. So for me, again, I feel like I'm overusing this word, but the word naturally, which is that it feels it's hard for me to identify, because it's all seemed, in my mind, it's a natural progression between, like, I really feel like I can draw a line directly from whatever I'm doing to Art Blakey, like to the most remote seeming influences. I feel as though there is a connection there for me. I try not to think. The other thing for me is that I don't think in style necessarily, as I try not to practice that way is stylistically, because even though, again, we're talking about the rules, right? It's like early on when I first practiced, like, again, talking about middle school, elementary school, like maybe a little bit in high school too, style is an important factor in what's happening and getting a general understanding. But my whole way of thinking is about drawing connections between two things that don't seem related. So for me, I feel as though I'm always, instead of trying to differentiate between two things, I'm always trying to find, like, well, how are they similar? How are these people? What do they have in common? And I feel like obviously they're not the same thing. You don't want to say that two people are the same, or two different things are the same thing. But by finding that common ground, I feel like, honestly, that helps identify how they're different more than trying to separate them in your mind just because, oh, this is this thing and this is that thing. You kind of don't really have any idea of what, to me, seeing the common ground it makes the differences stand out even more. Whereas, like, okay, this happens, this is Dennis Chambers, or this is Art Blakey, this is Philly Joe, this is Elvin Jones, this is Tony Williams, this is Dave Weckl, this is, Jeff Porcaro, this is Clyde Stubblefield. And if you separate them, in my opinion, you actually don't get to see them as clearly. But when you bring them together, you see them like, oh, wow, okay, there's all this overlap. But then the thing that really makes them stand out are these choices, like this type of thing. Clyde Stubblefield is going to do this. Like he's never going to do, he does all the, he and, Jeff McCall, they may have all these common ground, but then in the far columns, you see, oh, wow. But the things that really make them different is that Clyde Stubblefield will never do this thing that Jeff McCarl does. And Jeff McCarl will never do this thing that Clyde Stubblefield does. And that's how you can tell them apart. So all that to say, I don't necessarily think stylistically from a practicing standpoint, everything that I do, even from a long time ago, even though again, wasn't as clear then, but definitely from, late middle school, early high school to now, all of that I practice is just fundamentals. For me, I feel very strongly that it's better to, deepening my fundamentals is the only way to really be able to approach any musical scenario and feel like I can do it. I have something to say.
And what does that mean for you at this stage of your development? I understand early on you're learning rudiments and Wilcoxon and this sort of thing. What does developing your fundamentals mean for you now? Are you a practice pad every day kind of person? Are you always on the kit? What kind of things do you work on?
I go to practice every day. That's kind of like if I'm not traveling, but I go to practice every day. It's become very ritualistic for me because I've been doing it so long. Like I feel like I've been playing drums every day for a long time. So that when I don't do it, it makes me, I don't feel, it feels weird.
Yeah.
But for me, the fundamentals is rudiments still, things, rudiments, things like that. I try to separate things into 4 or 5 different categories, right? Mentally speaking, which is, you have feel, you have rudiments, you have technique, independence, and then kind of like an other category that just has like miscellaneous things that maybe kind of fall into those categories, but are not specifically any of those. And I feel as though by looking at it like that, you understand everything that anyone does, whether you like it. If you like it, it can be broken down into those categories of like, what is this thing that's happening? Maybe the 5th one is personality. Now that I think about it, that's maybe the last one. One of the things I talk about with students is, there's vocabulary, right? And it's good to learn vocabulary. And obviously early on, I didn't think like this, but again, the past maybe 10, 15 years, this is how I've thought is I try not to be too like learning licks and stuff. Like I don't devote a lot of time to learning licks. More than anything, what I try to do is when I hear something that someone's playing, I try to break it down. I try to figure out what it is and like what it's made of. It's not necessarily, I want to just repeat that thing. I want to figure out what is the thing made of. And then by breaking it down, maybe it's like, oh, okay, this is the, what it is the 6-stroke roll. It's sped up and the accents on the end and it's coming on these beats. From that standpoint, then I can say like, okay, now, because it's the 6-stroke roll, you can come up with your own variations of these things that you heard rather than just having one piece of information that, you only can use in one context. Now you have something that is going to stay with you and that you can use anywhere you like because you know what it's made of. You know what it is. It's not made up of like, it's not just one sort of unchangeable.
Yeah, like one word that you just try to stuff in to a conversation.
Exactly. I try to come at things from that standpoint. Even, like I was talking about vocabulary, obviously there are bebop phrases, things like that, great drum phrases that we all know and love. I try to figure those things out as well. And I've learned from practicing the fundamentals, it makes that process quicker. Like the more I tell students that all the time is that, funnily enough, the more and more I've learned rudiments and the deeper I've gotten into that, the more it is when I hear somebody do something, I can tell right away what they're like. I know immediately what they're playing and I can come up with, different stickings, different phrasings, different ideas very quickly, just because I have that level of insight into practicing and into my fundamentals. I don't know. For me, the musicians I love and I grew up listening to, I feel like were people that were but were really great musicians in any context that they were in, whether it was, a more R&B type setup or gospel thing to if it was going to be like a jazz type thing. And it didn't feel, the people I'm talking about are very, it's not a lot. There's not a lot of those people. Don't get me wrong. There's very few people that can do all of it convincingly, but I
Right.
always wanted to be one of those people. And so practice wise, I try to practice in a way, at least for me, the way I approach that is the only way to get to a point where I can play without barriers is to make sure I'm not putting up barriers in the first place in my mind. Like, don't think of things, again, going back to just the way that you think, is trying not to get too into thinking of like, well, this thing is this thing, and this thing is this thing, and this thing is this thing, and they never have
Mm.
any overlap, and there's no common ground. And just because it just, to me, it might help. It makes things easier to identify, but it also, in my opinion, sort of oversimplifies things.
And it's limiting.
It's limiting, right? It's very limiting. It's an oversimplification
Hmm.
of things. So I try not to think like that. Soloing wise, though, it's just something that's developed naturally. You know what I mean? I don't necessarily think about it all too much. And like I said, from a visual perspective, I do sometimes think of, especially that wave solo. I had an option there of what to do, and I like the idea of it being sort of something that was immediately, because the whole song, again, thinking of like the whole song as a crescendo, right? Or like as a wave sort of rising. And like, to me, that solo there needs to be the crashing of the way, like it needs to hit the water. So that's why it's like right away, it just hits and it goes and goes and goes. And then there's an abrupt ending. And that's it. And I think soloing wise, those are going back to the practicing. That's sometimes part of the assignments that I'll give myself. It's like, okay, now you need to take a solo that does this, that functions this way. You know what I mean? You need to take a solo that it needs to be at this dynamic level. It needs to have this sort of feeling to it, or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever you can think of.
Yeah. So another thing that I'm curious about, and I don't want to keep you too much longer.
No, you're good. You're good.
You started playing with Vijay Iyer when you were pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm really curious about is, what was your process for learning his music when you first started playing with him? And has that changed at all with where you are at now, where his music is at now, and your comfortability together? Can you talk a little? Because his music is so complex.
Yeah.
Or it can be thought of as complex if you're looking at
Of
it
course.
on the page. What was your process for that? And what's it like now?
Early on, it was one. It's been great playing with Vijay all these years, I have to say. But early on, it was definitely very daunting because I was coming into a scenario where I started playing with him with his sextet project, and then his trio. But that's even in the trio setting. I mean, you're talking, and the sextet even is like, that's a band that's existed actually for like 5 or 6 years,
Right.
maybe even longer than that, maybe 10. So you have like 10 years of music to to learn.
Yes.
And with the trio, it's like now you're talking about like 25 years of music to learn. So it was very daunting. I learned the music from the record first. I do have to say Vijay was very helpful. And he was, I would say, patient, even when there was things that I maybe didn't understand. But I was also just very determined to, I considered it, and I still do. I considered it a great honor to be in that band because of the drummers who had held that, or who hold that seat before me,
Oh,
like
yes.
Marcus and Tyshawn, and just so many great people. Those are the people that I respect and look up to.
So when you said you were learning from the records, were you learning it before seeing the music?
No. He gave me the charts, and
Okay.
then, but I meant like in terms of, if you have 10 years of music, like what music to learn first. I was learning the music from the record.
Oh, I see.
First.
I see. I gotcha.
Yeah. But it was a real challenge. I got lucky, I think, because all my friends write complicated music and like odd times and stuff. It's
Right.
something that we've been dealing with for a long time. So Joel Ross and James Francies and Emmanuel Wilkins, like I've known these guys for a long time, and they've been, to me, we kind of normalized all of that. So it wasn't like seeing these charts from Vijay was like, oh my God, it's in 5, that wasn't happening. But there was, I kind of like to think of it when you learn people's music, you sort of get especially when you see their charts, you sort of get a window into the way that they think about
Hmm.
music and the way that they approach things. So, the way that Vijay approaches playing in five and the way that Joel approaches playing in five, they're different things. You know what I mean? So there was a lot of, I think that was one of the things I was learning early on was just how to approach these figures and these different rhythmic ideas in a way that was consistent with Vijay, obviously, but also consistent with myself in terms of what can I, because it's like that was the other thing about it is that Vijay never talking about those guys Marcus and Tyshawn, there was never a point when, and to this day there's never been a point where he's asked me to play like either of those people or you know do that type of thing. Even he's always left the door wide open to whatever whatever I can bring to the table.
And were you comfortable playing that music right away in that you didn't find yourself settling into playing sort of parts, for a lack of a
No.
better way? And because you seem so free now, when I
Yeah.
hear you play with him now, it seems so free. But I can imagine you at some point had to sort of come up with a part at first, right?
Early on, I feel like there were certain songs that were like that for me. It was very don't let me. I mean, again, I don't want to rewrite history, but it was difficult to learn, and there were some songs that were way more challenging than others, and sort of like it was less open than I would have liked it to be. Like I
Mm,
had to sort of stay. I call it like just staying home. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Which is there's interaction. There's interaction that can still happen. It's not like I have to ignore everybody and I can't be myself, but it was definitely less risky than what I was willing to do later on, and definitely less risky than what I can do now.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. So to answer your question, absolutely. There was definitely a point on some of this, not all of it, but there was a few tunes early on that were really challenging. In the sense that I was like, I just feel like I really haven't internalized this idea, and I really have to do that to get to where I am trying to get to that level of freedom. I need to internalize this. So obviously I was practicing and trying to do that, but then in some of the first few gigs, that was what I was doing
Yeah.
as well, is like trying to really just make sure that keep things on the rails. You know what I mean?
Right, right. Okay, I guess I kind of want to start winding down now because I've kept you for a long time now. There's just a few questions, and
You're good, man.
these aren't too heavy. One is a technical question. I've noticed when you're playing matched grip that your
Mhm,
index finger is extended a lot of the time.
mhm.
And rather than having the fulcrum between your thumb and index finger,
Right.
it's back a bit. Is that something that's very conscious for you? And are you doing that for a reason or?
Yes. So I can do it the other way, especially now. That's actually something I've been working on. But basically, it's just my grip, especially in my left hand, or really in both hands, but in my right hand, a lot of the action, even when the fulcrum is between my thumb and index finger, a lot of the action is coming from the back two fingers, especially.
Okay.
So at times I've learned I can remove the thumb and index finger and use sort of the shape of my hand as the fulcrum
Mm,
and just use the back fingers to do it.
okay.
Now I try not to, with the left hand, it depends on what kind of left hand day I'm having. Like I said, it's something I'm working on now, but with the left hand, sometimes the index finger sticks out it's very rigid, but the process for me has been getting that to be more relaxed, because even when I do that with my right hand, I can do it and there's no tension. You know what I mean? So to me, that's the process, is just removing that tension and trying to make it more relaxed and make that left hand stronger.
Yeah. What sticks do you use? And how did you arrive at what sticks you play?
The Vic Firth 5A barrel tips is what I use.
Okay.
God, I've gone through a lot of different ones. I've been using these for the past probably 5 years now, something like that. But before that, there was a time when what was I using? I was using like a 5B. I like the barrel tips. The reason I arrived at those is because the teardrop shape on the tip, I feel like gives you the most. Everybody. There was a time when the SD2s, the Bolero,
Right,
right?
right.
Those are some. It's a great set of sticks. The blade vibes. But for me, I what I love most about those is just the sound that they get off the cymbal, basically, and I loved the round tip. So the 5/8 barrel, it gives me that sort of thing, but also has some real. It's a lot more. It's heavier, bit more solid than maybe an SD2 or even a regular 5/8.
Mm.
So I can. It's a little bit longer than a 5/8 as well.
Oh, okay,
So
okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I haven't checked those out.
yeah, they're cool, man. I like them a lot. But it feels like a good intersection between something that gives me a nice sound off the cymbals, feels nice in my hand, very balanced, very solid, which I like, and also, if it works at a variety of volumes. If I want to play lighter, it still can kind of work. And if I need to play louder, then it breathes and it goes into that very well.
Okay, okay. Maybe this is the last question, and it's something that's not directly music related, but you tour so much. You're
Hmm.
gone from home. I'm curious what your favorite parts of touring are and any kind of rituals you have. Like when you're in a new city, what are the things that you like to do and what are the things that you do to sort of keep a routine so you don't feel so, discombobulated every time you're bouncing around to time zones and such?
It's very chaotic, to be honest. I feel one of the main something that I've learned from many years of traveling is that one of the first things I try to do is drink a lot of water. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which sounds very like whatever,
Oh
but
no, that's a big thing.
it's a big factor, especially when traveling because air travel it really dehydrates you, and then you're dealing with time zones, you're dealing with jet lag, blah 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 blah. So I try to make sure that one of the first things I always do is get my hands on a lot of water and just try to force myself to drink an insane amount because I feel like that helps regulate my system a little bit more.
Hmm.
I also sometimes it depends on the tour schedule. Sometimes if it's just back to back and you're going to be traveling to different cities every day, it can be hard to get a routine. So sometimes my priority is just that, like hydrating and make sure that I eat enough food, and then make sure that I'm resting when I need to rest. You know what I mean? And just kind of doing everything in service of the way I started to think about it is that I want to feel the best when I play. Like whenever the concert is,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that's when I want to be feeling great. If I feel not so great all the other times of the day, that's fine. But like as long as during the show, like I feel good, that's the most important thing. Another ritual that I do in terms of, I always try to find good food somewhere, or
Oh
like
yeah, yeah.
go to take myself to a really nice meal somewhere and just have just some great food because that always puts me in a good mood for the show. Again, these are like very simple things, but they really, in terms of rituals, these are really important things to me, and they're things that they move the needle for me performance
Oh
wise.
yeah.
So
Do you have a favorite food city that you're always psyched to see come up on your schedule?
Spain, Barcelona is a big one.
Hmm.
Barcelona always have good food there. I always have a lot of good food there. Almost anywhere in Italy, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like Paris, obviously. I feel like the food. This is the other thing is Japan. I mean, Tokyo is great.
Mm, mm-hmm.
I feel like the food is generally speaking very good, no matter where you are. But much like music, the context is going to determine, you can't be looking for, great Mexican food where there's not going to be great
Yeah, yeah,
Mexican.
yeah.
And then be like, this Mexican food is terrible. It's like,
Right, right,
yes, but
right.
that's not really, you're not supposed to be eating that here. You got to eat, what's good. So,
All right, cool. Well, we can wrap up. I know that you have a busy summer coming up. I think I saw that you're going to Siena, Italy for
mhm,
the workshop there to be on faculty, which is very cool.
of course.
Do you have anything else coming up this summer you want folks to know about? And what's the best place for people to stay up with what you're doing?
I would say the best place to stay up with me is on Instagram because I've gotten so bad at updating my website. In fact, maybe I'll do that today is update my tour dates on my website. But I'm excited about these Vijay dates next week in June. I'm going to Europe with Maria Grand, great saxophone player, and Joel Ross later this month. I think on the 17th, I'll be there.
Oh, cool.
And then I have my own show with music from the record at New Blue on June 27th.
Oh, nice.
So that'll be great. I'm looking forward to that. Then in July, Sienna is coming up, but I'll also be, before that, I'll be in Europe with Joel Ross. And then before I go to Europe with Joel, I'll actually be in Funchal in Portugal with Vijay doing the trio date out there.
Oh, cool.
And so a lot of good stuff going. I'm really looking forward to it. Like I said, if you want to, the best place to keep up with me always is on Instagram. And for anyone looking to talk to me, I'm pretty easy I try to remain easy to reach and to talk to. So Instagram is a good way to do that.
All right, cool, man. Well, I really appreciate you doing this. It means a lot. It was wonderful meeting you in person. This has been great, too. And I'll continue to be a huge fan, and I'll let you know when this episode drops. And
please, brother, thank you so much for having me as a part of this, man. This is a great platform, man. So kudos to you. And obviously, thanks again for checking out the record. And I'm really glad that you enjoyed it. And it was totally great meeting you in person. It was a very cool experience, man. I'm glad that you were there. Let's keep up with each other.
All right, man. Cool. Well, I appreciate it. And you have a good summer, and we'll talk soon.
Will do, brother. Take care.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe on your platform of choice and share it with a friend. You can find the show at practicingdrummer.com or on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram as Practicing Drummer.